So let's take a look at, we talked about how populations are concentrated in certain areas, and we also asked the question, is this a dry world? And so let's talk about that, and a good framework is let's look at what we looked at in Europe and in Russia, and then expand that a little bit. That this part of the world can give us some examples of some of the climate types that we talked about in the introduction to the course. So we have sea or mild climates in Europe, mostly because of the North Atlantic drift, which keeps it relatively warm in the wintertime. In Russia, however, you have a continental climate, a D climate, which is severely cold in the wintertime. Now, as we move further south, and especially along this latitude here around 30 degrees north or south, we get into an area that is relatively dry, and these are the B climates. So this kind of yellow color here is showing where we have B, which are either desert or grassland climates. So we have some exceptions up in parts of Iran and Turkey, but for the most part, this part of the world is dominated by B climates. So B are dry climates. They include deserts and grassland. This is a climate graph. This is some examples in California. This is a desert, this climate graph is in Death Valley. And the thing to note about it is the very low amount of rainfall that it gets. So these blue bars should be the amount of rainfall. In Death Valley, there's very little. This is another example of a B climate, a steppe or a grassland climate. And this is Fresno, actually. So Fresno also has a B climate, but it's not a desert. It's a little bit wetter than that. So you can see we get a modest amount of rain in the wintertime, very dry in the summer, but that the desert and the steppe, which is like a grassland, are two dominant climate types in this part of the world. This is a scene of a desert in the Sinai Peninsula. This is a grassland as you get in Turkey. Maybe the one thing to note is that these have short grasses over much of the terrain. These are mostly absent of vegetation in the desert, except for plants that are very well adapted to these types of environments. If you recall in the introduction to the course, we talked about what are the things that influence climate, and the three factors include latitude, position within the landmass, and elevation. So here, this latitude of around 30 degrees north and south are amongst the driest parts of the world. We call this the subtropical high pressure zone, and it just happens to coincide with where we find drier climates, because this is where air, rather than rising and creating wet conditions, air is descending and creating dry conditions. Elevation and position within the landmass can play a role as well. We talked about the Atacama Desert, which is the driest desert in the world, because it's in the rain shadow of the Andes Mountains and is in a place where the winds are blowing in the opposite direction from the mountains. They're blowing, since they have to travel up the mountains, it becomes severely dry on the Atacama. And position within the landmass plays a role in ocean currents, because these are cold ocean currents off the coast. They play a role as well. So these are various factors that create these dry places in the world. Here in the United States, we talked about the rain shadow effect. This is another example of both position within the landmass because of how the air moves, and also elevation because of the role of mountains in creating what's called a rain shadow effect. This is from my physical geography class showing the distribution of these B dry climates, the lighter color being deserts, the darker color being more grasslands. And you can see from the Arabian Peninsula through North Africa, it is clearly dominated by these climates, but not completely. It's not completely dominated. There are exceptions. We do have mountains in this part of the world. They're not quite as impressive as the Andes Mountains or the Sierra Nevada, but there are some, probably the one I really want you to take note of is the Atlas Mountains, because the Atlas Mountains create sort of a reverse rain shadow effect, because while there's a rain shadow behind these mountains, there's wetter conditions in front of the mountains where the air is kind of moving against the mountains, creating a little bit of wetter conditions along this top edge, this area called the Maghreb. There's also some mountains in Iran, in Turkey. They have some, modest mountains on the top, the Pontic, and some modest mountains at the bottom, the Taurus, and fairly high mountains in Iran called the Zagros. And part of the reason that you have these mountains is because of plate tectonics, that the African and European continents are actually kind of slowly moving towards each other, creating these kind of ripple effects as this happens. Here's a picture of the Atlas Mountains. You can see quite dry in the background, but up along the edge there, it's more of a Mediterranean climate, much like much of California, more like a general California climate along the edge. You can see it's a little bit more green in the foreground along that Mediterranean edge. Here when we get to the northern part of Turkey, we've really kind of gotten out of the dry climates altogether. This is a very wet area in the northern edge of Turkey along the Pontic Mountains. You can see from this picture that this is not kind of what you might typically think of as a Middle East desert type environment. As you get into the interior, it's more grassland and steppe. This is in Turkey. And this is the Sinai Peninsula, where we had this photo as an example earlier. You have extremely dry conditions. This is straight up desert. And this is in the Sahara. You actually have some parts of the Sahara where you can have sand seas. Most deserts are vegetated, but you can have large sand areas, vast stretches of sand in some parts of the Sahara where it's most extreme. So probably the takeaway here is that while this part of the world is dominated by dry climates, there are exceptions. Like there are wet parts of Turkey. There are reverse rain shadow effects on this edge of the Atlas Mountains. But mostly it's a very dry world. But I think this is going to be the thing about when we talk about dry world, Islamic world, Arab world. It is mostly, but not all. So it is mostly dry, but not all dry. There are exceptions. Okay, so that being said, generally speaking, we can say that this part of the world is more so than many others dominated by arid or dry climates, and that most of the land is not suitable for what we call dry land farming. Dry land farming is being able to farm using rainfall and not relying on irrigation. So because of that, irrigation is crucial in this part of the world, as it is in California as well, because we're relatively dry in the Central Valley. But irrigation is required to grow food in much of this part of the world. However, we do have some wetter climates along the coast, especially. So again, if we look at these population patterns along these coasts, a little bit wetter. Turkey has more mild or wetter climate, a little more people, and where you have access to water, like the Nile River here, you can have large concentrations of people.